Hello, everyone. This is Connor. I'm the executive editor of the Law Journal. Thank you so much for being with us in person and online. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. So here is Chris Chapman. He has more than 25 years of experience working in the field of international human rights law and rights of minority groups and Indigenous people. He is currently an Indigenous rights researcher and advisor at Amnesty International, where he mainly works on the rights of Indigenous peoples in relation to conservation, protected areas, and the promotion of biodiversity. Thanks so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to read from my laptop. It's a real honor to be here today. I want to express my thanks to the IPLP program, to Robert, and also to Mia and the Arizona Journal of Environmental Law and Policy for inviting me to be part of this really rich discussion, to listen to these really inspiring and knowledgeable speakers. I hope that I can somehow live up to what has gone before and add to that debate. So as this seminar is being held to commemorate the International Day Against Racism and the International Day of Forests, which were yesterday, I wanted to explore the themes of colonialism and othering and how it relates to the theme of conservation and protected areas. As we know, the overwhelming burden of expectation for protecting biodiversity falls on Indigenous peoples and on their territories and other land-dependent rural communities, many of these in the Global South. Global North countries effectively abdicate responsibility for biodiversity protection, apart from some lip service paid to national parks. And I'm going to use the term capitalized societies, and I just came up with this, and please do critique it, because these terms are difficult. Like Global North, I find a problematic term. It doesn't necessarily take into account how the economy globally is changing as we speak very rapidly, and terms like the Global North become increasingly meaningless, although they have a kind of a meaning that many of us understand. By capitalized societies, I mean societies which are imprinted with the impact of capitalism. This is kind of non-Amnesty speak. At Amnesty, we're not really supposed to talk about political models and one model being good and one model being bad. We're supposed to be completely agnostic on that. But seeing as I'm speaking here as a member of the advisory committee of the IPLP, I think I can exercise a little bit of poetic license and use my own terminology. So I hope this term capitalized societies is understandable to people, just how capitalism is imprinted, the way societies are run, and the priorities that they have, and the priorities that they work towards. It includes obviously countries, the traditional countries, the colonial countries of the Global North, but obviously increasingly many other societies around the world, emerging economies and so on. I feel that the fact of this abdicating, capitalized societies abdicating responsibility for biodiversity leads to a model that I would call zero biodiversity over here, 100% biodiversity over there. And I'll try to explain that more as I go along. This model has given a huge impetus to the conservation industry, driven by funding from Global North countries and the big green NGOs, the conservation NGOs, who rely on funding from the public and government promoting fortress conservation in Global South countries. I think I would argue that we can consider the funding raised by conservation NGOs from the general public and the publicity that they send to supporters to keep them donating as a form of radicalization. If we see radicalization as the process by which people are indoctrinated to commit or support acts of violence and extremism against specific groups or peoples, as is the case with fortress conservation. Fortress conservation provides incentives to governments, particularly in the Global South, but not only, to violate the rights of their own peoples, providing opportunities for financial gain by inducing these governments to follow donors' agendas and in so doing commit gross violations against their own populations. This makes them less accountable to their own people and more accountable to their donors, therefore undermining the rule of law in those countries. While that view looks at the dynamic between global South and global North countries, which is based on colonialism, there is another dynamic within countries between governments on the one hand and marginalized indigenous peoples and other land-dependent rural communities on the other. This results in part from the breaking down of accountability of governments to their own peoples as described above. A process of othering of indigenous peoples is highly relevant to the dynamics around conservation. Othering is, as Robert explained yesterday, the starting point for racism. As Robert said, you are a hunter-gatherer, I am a scientist. You are a hunter-gatherer, I'm an engineer, etc. Indigenous peoples are othered as primitive, as not being part of the modern industrial world. In the best case scenario, this can result in indigenous peoples being seen as having a role in nature conservation because that accords with their allegedly pre-modern way of life. But this breaks down when their governments are incentivized, in part by the international fortress conservation dynamic, to evict indigenous peoples from their lands in order to seize control of the income revenues attached to them. This necessitates a further level of othering. Indigenous peoples are characterized as having forgotten the old ways and therefore only doing damage on their territories. For example, cutting down trees to make houses or charcoal to cook food. So in 2019, I did some research in the Democratic Republic of Congo, looking at the Kahuzi-Biega National Park in South Kivu. And I interviewed a number of Batwa and Bambuti people who had been evicted from that park and had experienced various violations, killings, rapes, etc. It really struck me how I would have be in a restaurant or a pub and speaking to somebody, and they suddenly turned out to have an opinion on the national park. And more often than not, they would say something like, I would be saying, well, you know, these people should be allowed to return to their ancestral territories. And more often than not, they would look at me bemused and baffled and say, yeah, but don't you realize they've forgotten how to live on those territories? And I think that's a classic example of how that othering takes place. You have the ideal othering of an indigenous people, which is that they have this link to nature. But as soon as that link breaks down, then they're again othered as it's like a bit like the Hollywood good Indian, bad Indian trope. You're either a good Indian who knows how to live with nature, but if you're a bad Indian, you're the ultimate traitor to your people if you've forgotten how to live on the land. As if somebody who was evicted 10 or 20 years ago would have completely forgotten the skills that they exercised on their territories that number of years ago. Another bad Indian trope is the poacher who is in league with foreign trafficking networks, or the corrupt leader who makes deals with mining companies to sign away his people's heritage and permit the poisoning of their lands. But what I want to talk about is another way in which indigenous peoples are othered, and this is by exoticizing them. This is a so-called positive way of othering, which, I mean, there isn't a positive way of othering, but it's cast as a positive way of othering. So we're all very familiar with the way that governments monetize the cultures of indigenous peoples by, for example, putting up beautiful photos at their airports of people in traditional dress or carrying out traditional activities, cultural activities, dances, and so on. And all the while committing gross violations against those same peoples. But I want to talk about another way we may be guilty of exoticizing indigenous peoples. So we know the science of conservation. Study after study has shown that indigenous peoples are more successful at biodiversity conservation than governments and conservation NGOs. 80% of the world's biodiversity is on their lands, a statistic that has been quoted, I think, more than once during this symposium. But I would argue that there is a dangerous tendency to describe indigenous peoples as having a unique, special, or even mystical relationship with nature, which creates a false dichotomy between indigenous peoples who have a relationship with nature and those in the capitalized societies who don't. Organizations like my own can be equally guilty of this. In reality, nature has a profound meaning to all peoples, and even the idea that humans are somehow not part of nature is absurd. It is, of course, true that many people in the capitalized societies have become significantly alienated from nature, But examples abound of people who have never given up that relationship or are fighting very hard to regain it, and for whom nature has a profound meaning that goes far beyond a question of income or daily work activity. It is important to remember that the period of history in which capitalized societies have increasingly become alienated from nature is very recent. It is equivalent to the bat of an eyelid when you compare it to the tens of thousands of years of human history. Our cultures, our mythologies, our fairy tales, our songs are all profoundly rooted in nature. This is evidenced in the yearning for nature that expresses itself in 1,000 different ways, some of them distorted and problematic. For example, the idea that we can appreciate nature in zoos or national parks or safaris, or even by admiring animals in museums, stuffed animals in museums. What is missing to many people in capitalized societies, but by no means all people, is the day-to-day experience of living with nature, working with nature, and the knowledge and experience that generates, knowledge that is alive and well among Indigenous peoples. So I want to use an example from my country to illustrate this connection with nature. There's been a scandal which has been brewing for many years in Scotland, which is around a golf course financed by Donald Trump, called Trump International Golf Links, which is in Aberdeenshire. In this project, enormous pressure was exercised on local people to sell up their land in order to enable this golf course. He actually initially bought a huge tract of land, hundreds of acres, and he had enough land for his golf course, but his view of things was that he had to even buy up all the land of people around the golf course, because he didn't like the idea that people might be too close to his golf course or possibly financially benefiting from the increased value that he had brought to that land. But people refused to sell up because it was a magical place. That was why he bought the land, because he'd gone there and immediately seen the magic of it. And the people who lived there saw the magic, and the extraordinary nature of the nature of that was there. So they didn't want to sell up, but enormous pressure was put on them to sell up. One of the reasons that people were resisting this project was there are sand dunes called the Foveran Links sand dunes, and the golf course was basically going to be built on those sand dunes. The Foveran Links were a site of special scientific interest, which is one of the categories of protected areas which the UK reports on to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it is one of the protected areas which is meant to help the UK meet its target of 30%. It was previously the 17% target in the HE targets, and now in the Global Biodiversity Framework from Montreal, the 30% target. So there was enormous resistance to this, to the golf course. Now, after the building of the golf course, the site of special scientific interest in Foveran Links has now been removed, because the golf course succeeded in damaging the area to such an extent that it could no longer be considered a site of special scientific interest. It no longer had that unique nature which was the reason for it getting that category in the first place. So it had to have that status taken away from it. And also to note here that Scottish crofters, who are small holding farmers with a history going back many centuries of farming, have claimed indigenous status in the UK, a claim that has not yet received a positive response from government either in Edinburgh or in London. I think this demonstrates the skewed way, the colonial way that biodiversity protection happens in countries which are former colonial power, like the UK. The UK, when it reports on its targets for to the Convention on Biological Diversity, includes what used to be known as areas of outstanding natural beauty, and they're now known as national landscapes. The current government changed the name for no particularly good reason. The areas of outstanding natural beauty are basically national parks which weren't quite good enough to be national parks. They weren't quite special enough. They weren't quite protected enough. They didn't have quite enough biodiversity. They're actually vast areas which include huge areas of monoculture farming. The idea that this could contribute to 30 by 30 is really problematic, and it shows the problem of these numerical targets. Simply saying 30 by 30, 30% of protected areas, and simply just counting up surface area and saying, well, yes, we're meeting our target. The UK says they currently have 28% of national surface area linking, which they can claim and submit to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the UK reckons that it's almost reached that 30% target. But as the areas of outstanding natural beauty show, it's a problematic claim, because if you're including monoculture farming as your high-level biodiversity claim, then it kind of shows that target as the problematic nature of having a numerical target for biodiversity. So this contributes to the idea that in the parts of the world where capitalism has taken hold, there is no hope for promoting biodiversity, and we must concentrate all of our efforts on the so-called wildernesses, whether they be in the Amazon, the Congo Basin, or the north of Canada. This is the model that I mentioned earlier: zero biodiversity here, 100% biodiversity there. And I think this is, again, this is why I'm trying to argue that this idea that we create this dichotomy between indigenous peoples who have a link to nature and other peoples who don't, it's problematic, because that contributes to this idea of yes, let's forget biodiversity here, let's do it over there, let's raise funds from the general public to promote fortress conservation in these countries over there, because that's where we have a hope for protecting biodiversity. This is what makes the forced evictions in Loliondo in Tanzania possible. It's not enough for indigenous peoples to be seen as the best or the most successful custodians of biodiversity. They have to go one step further and demonstrate that they have absolutely no footprint on their ecosystems. So the idea that an indigenous person can keep one cow or cut down one tree is evidence that they're not, after all, the wonderful custodians of nature that we thought they were. No one seems to ask the question, what happens to the tens of thousands of Maasai who are proposed to be evicted from Loliondo? It is assumed that this will resolve the so-called problem of their impact on the ecosystem, whereas in reality, they will go to a refugee camp in Kenya or a town or a city in Tanzania, where they will most likely live in an informal settlement, buying food in plastic containers and not knowing where to throw away those plastic containers once used. Carbon credits are another illustration of this 0% biodiversity here, 100% biodiversity over there model. It's an easy mechanism to allow busy city dwellers, whether they live in London, Sao Paulo, or Mumbai, to outsource their biodiversity responsibilities to the wildernesses and salve their consciences with one swipe of a credit card. I want to stress that what I'm saying about the othering of indigenous peoples of having a unique connection to land. I want to stress that this is absolutely not to undermine the underpinning of indigenous peoples' rights, that they have unique cultures and collective ways of life that require specific actions by states. The fact that each people has a unique culture and a way of life must not lead to a false assumption that there is something that separates all indigenous peoples from the rest of humanity. That's what I'm calling othering. It is also important to recognize that while many people in the capitalized societies are fighting to protect or regain their relationship with nature, the collective aspect of their cultures and societies has largely broken down, which fortunately in the case of many indigenous peoples is not the case. Hence the special nature of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights regime and the pressing need to continue to find ways to apply it and to enforce it. Another example demonstrating how the othering of indigenous peoples as having a unique connection to nature breaks down is found in the Kunming-Montreal framework, which Helen spoke about just now and which many other speakers have spoken about. So in Target 3, as Helen was mentioning, Target 3 states that says that states will ensure and enable that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial and inland water areas and of marine and coastal areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, are effectively conserved and managed through ecologically representative, well-connected and equitably governed systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, recognizing indigenous and traditional territories where applicable. So that bit, recognizing indigenous and traditional territories, and Helen spoke about this. And Juan was also mentioning this yesterday. the demand from Indigenous peoples that their own work to conserve nature on their own sovereign territories be respected and recognized in global protected area targets. As Juan said, this demand was rejected in the form that Indigenous peoples were positing it. And what we got instead was this fudged text, which doesn't even remotely meet the demand of Indigenous peoples that their own territories be recognized as an entirely separate third category of conservation initiative, separate from the existing categories in Target 3, protected areas, which are the classic national parks, etc., and other effective area-based conservation measures, which is, I won't go into that, but another a protected area, which isn't quite a protected area. So I was in Montreal when the biodiversity framework was being finalized, and I had a conversation with a woman who worked for a Scandinavian environmental organization, an NGO. And I was explaining to her this demand, and she knew about the demand from Indigenous peoples to have their own territories recognized as a third category within Target 3. And she was very, very strongly against it. Her worry was that this demand would dilute Target 3. So, for example, a country like Brazil would just go, oh, well, that's great. You know, we've got like millions of acres, millions of square kilometers of indigenous territories which are demarcated and recognized. We're just going to declare them today, you know, from today till tomorrow, overnight. We're going to declare them as part of our target, 30% for Target 3. Job done. Don't need to do anything else. That was her worry. She may have a point. She may have had a point. But I think that's, can we put blame Indigenous peoples for that? I think that's the problem of the state governments who are at Montreal. That's their problem to resolve that. They could maybe set a higher target. If we're going to include Indigenous peoples' territories, let's set a higher target, 50%, 60%, 70%, or let's, you know, have separate numerical targets for the 3 categories in Target 3. There's ways around that. But what we got instead was, because of that reluctance, we got this fudged language recognizing Indigenous and traditional territories, where it's really not clear. Does that mean that states must recognize Indigenous people's own conservation efforts on their own territories and not interfere with them? It just says recognizing them. Does that mean that they can still go in there and take over and say, right, we're declaring this a national park without your consent? It's really not clear, and that's why it didn't meet with the demands of Indigenous peoples in Montreal. I would say it's possibly one of the most glaring failures of the coming Montreal framework. It further incentivized states to evict Indigenous peoples from their territories, or at the very least to establish protected areas on their lands without their consent. They have a target, 30% to meet, and if the concept of Indigenous run and governed protected areas is not sufficiently clear, states may well conclude that the only way to meet the target is by establishing good old-fashioned protected areas run by the state on Indigenous lands. The conservation activists that I spoke to in Montreal clearly thought that this was regrettable, but it could not be a reason for sacrificing the holy grail of 30 by 30. And the reason this is possible is that the othering of Indigenous peoples as being nature's friend or having this unique bond with nature does not include scientific credibility. It may be accepted that Indigenous peoples have traditional knowledge that is important in nature conservation, but this knowledge is not considered to be scientific. And it's a reminder here to note that the Special Rapporteur, Tzay, has urged us in his report on protected areas to talk about Indigenous scientific knowledge. That's the term that he wants us to use. Let's stop saying Indigenous traditional knowledge, because that is buying into this downgrading of Indigenous people's conservation and nature knowledge. So therefore, decision makers in Montreal, and not just decision makers, but also environmental activists like the woman I spoke to, will continue to resist moves by Indigenous peoples to take control of conservation. We can also see that in the discussions around how the coming Montreal framework will be monitored. There is a monitoring mechanism which is being finalized in the run-up to the Conference of Parties in Colombia in October. But this mechanism explicitly states that the data that feeds into monitoring the framework has to meet certain criteria. For example, originating in peer-reviewed academic articles. This is likely to systematically exclude the kinds of knowledge that Indigenous peoples can bring to the process. For example, oral knowledge. Where I do agree with Helen is that we must absolutely make the most of what we have on paper. There were incredible advances made in Montreal. There is great language in the Kunming Montreal framework. And I think what we have to do now is not despair, but to take what is on paper and to interpret it in the most progressive way possible, to insist on an absolutely positive interpretation of the language which is there. And there is other language in the framework which does help us with that. There is, for example, a commitment to recognize that nothing in the framework can take away from the Indigenous Peoples Human Rights, which are included in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So with that, I will stop. Thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to field any questions.
So much. If anyone in the audience has any questions, if you wouldn't mind choosing them, Chris, and I'll take a look online.
Sure. Yeah. I think we have one up here.
Hop Hopkins from Wildlife Guardians. I'm sorry, but I missed what you were saying towards the end. Switching the term from traditional indigenous knowledge to, was it traditional scientific knowledge?
Indigenous scientific knowledge.
And so how
that's the term that the Special Rapporteur is
that term is being driven from indigenous communities, or where's that term being developed in?
I mean, it was his recommendation in his most recent report on protected areas. I presume that he has, he's consulted and heard, asked, he's felt maybe Robert has something happening here.
I've talked to Francisco about that term when he insisted on it being used in the General Assembly report, and it's based on his experience, as Chris was saying, working with governments and conservation agencies where they downgrade, quote, traditional knowledge. It's not scientific. And we looked at a lot of literature which showed that Indigenous people do use scientific knowledge. What's the scientific method? Experimentation, testing, refinement, experimentation again, and eventually you get it right. So that was why Francisco has used that term.
I just wanted just a quick come back is I'm completely supportive of it. Just again, I'm just trying to find out what the origins of it is, because my understanding of it was the acknowledging a non-westernized conceptualization of knowledge attainment, not so much into what you just said in terms of codifying a world cosmology into a Western ideology. But if it's a term that's as we evolve into understanding more of indigenous sovereignty, I'm completely cool with using it.
From our panel, our symposium last year too, there was an entire panel that was on that term, and I think 3 or 4 different speakers were discussing it. And so it's on our website on AJELP.com. You can look at that reporting too.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Anything further from the audience? We have one online. I'll go to that. We have got a comment and a question from Maria Martinez, who says, yes, I understand that everyone has indigenous roots and a connection to nature, even folks from Europe, but until white people acknowledge all their privilege and power and the racism, this is a moot point, no? I can't pinpoint the problem in the speaker's argument of othering indigenous peoples, but there is a problem. Perhaps we need to normalize what it means to be indigenous rather than saying we are all the same. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, could you bring it up?
Sure, yeah.
I think it's a complex point. Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. There absolutely has to be a recognition. I didn't want to suggest that there shouldn't be a recognition of the privilege and power exercised by white people and by colonial powers. I'm not sure. So you saying I can't pinpoint the problem in the argument of othering, but there is a problem. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to address that, I think, in what I was saying. I was trying to be very careful about what I was saying, in that I'm not wanting to undermine the roots of the indigenous, the idea of special human rights regimes for particular categories of people. It's not just indigenous peoples. There are human rights regimes for children, for refugees, for minorities. I've been working in this area for 25 years. I would never want to undermine that. And I would absolutely accept that. I think the point is, what I'm just trying to say is, there isn't something like essentialist about the difference between indigenous peoples and other peoples. Like we're all humans. It's just that indigenous peoples have unique cultures which must be respected and protected. 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago, people in Britain were living probably the same way as indigenous peoples in many parts of the world are living now, in terms of that relationship with nature and in terms of that collective way of life. So that's what I'm trying to say. It's cultural and societal, the difference, rather than being essentialist. I don't know if that helps to meet the point.
I would assume so. Rob?
I have a question, Chris. I know that for years, Indigenous women's organizations, domestic violence advocates were trying to, bring attention to the public the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Amnesty comes in and does Maze of Injustice, and the next thing you know, we have congressional amendments to the Violence Against Women Act. Amnesty has tremendous power, and with that, I imagine, comes a sense of responsibility. But how bad does it have to get before Amnesty decides to focus on it? I guess that's, what is there some sort of gauge? How do you decide to sort of put all the resources and reputation that you have behind an issue?
That's a really good question. I would say it's entirely unscientific and it's entirely subjective, that process. I mean, we do really try, like we have as an absolute principle that we don't work on every human rights violation in the world, but a human rights violation has to reach a certain level. It should be a human rights violation which is sufficiently serious, but also it should be a human rights violation that we have a chance of influencing. Should also maybe be a human rights violation which not a ton of other NGOs are already working on, unless we can demonstrate that we have some unique added value that we can bring to a coalition of NGOs who are working on something already. But yeah, we get it all the time. Why are you not working on this? Like it's, and I don't think there is any science around that. It's entirely subjective. So that's probably an entirely unsatisfactory response to your question.
Yeah, one more.
The third category of land conservation you talk about piqued my interest. As I've said, in the Western US, if it's not national park or wilderness, there's going to be logging roads and logging companies. And then the example of Brazil, your colleague brought up, seems relevant. You don't want a country to already have a high baseline of roadless area that's depended on by indigenous people to get counted, and therefore they don't do anything else. Like Venezuela, for example, is 2/3 wilderness or roadless area depended on by indigenous people. Chavez wanted to build roads and help corporations. So has that third category gained any traction that you've seen, or could it?
I mean, I think it is gaining traction. You have the ICCA consortium, which has been mentioned already in the symposium, which is a very effective and really impressive organization, which is basically like a coalition of many peoples all over the world, indigenous and non-indigenous, who are basically running conservation on their own territories, and they have themselves recognized within the ICCA consortium. What is proving maybe difficult now is to sort of build up a database of those territories and to somehow find a way of including them in the 30 by 30 target. But those territories are there already. They're flourishing and they're doing conservation. It's really just a question of the international community sitting up and saying, oh yeah, this is being done and we should recognize this. But I would say, even without the CBD doing anything at all, those areas are flourishing, and maybe that's the important thing.
How would you suggest U.S. conservation and environmental organizations who are interested in evolving their work move to adopt this framework?
To adopt the Calí Montreal framework, the targets. Well, I mean, there's one question is about how it's done within the US, and another question is about how the conservation organizations are operating abroad. So organizations like the World Conservation Society have to fundamentally change their way of working. They are still operating according to fortress conservation principles in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. They're still operating, for example, Calí National Park, which I mentioned, which is an area which even like in the past few months, really horrendous attacks have taken place, militarized attacks on communities both inside and outside the park, which are justified by the fact that there are some armed non-state actors operating and action has to be taken against them. So the World Conservation Society is entirely complicit in that. The World Wildlife Fund, the US section of the World Wildlife Fund is entirely complicit in many of these human rights violations. As Professor John Knox was explaining yesterday, that how the World Wildlife Fund is trying to elude responsibility for what the violations that it's been implicitly supporting or even explicitly supporting in many parts of the world. So I think that is one thing that absolutely has to change. I think as far as what's going on with conservation in the US, I don't think I'm maybe the best expert to speak on that. And we probably have other experts who are more knowledgeable than me to speak.
As I see no further questions online, I'll give one more chance in the audience. And if not, could I get one last round of applause for Chris Butler?